thinking, reforming, and renewing what it looks like to be an evangelical Christian in today's world. And my interest in reforming evangelicalism developed after a series of painful and unfortunate events that took place over my past 4 years, at Moody Bible Institute in Chicago. Over the past 4 years, it was revealed to me just how much my tradition needed reforming. When I entered Moody Bible Institute in 2010, I was your ideal young evangelical. I was deeply involved in the neo-reformed Calvinist movement, a proud member of the Gospel Coalition, a self-identified Tea Party Republican. I was anti-gay, anti-Catholic, a biblical literalist who rejected evolution as a lie from Satan. I had pictures literally in my dorm room of John Calvin, Charles Spurgeon, and John Piper hanging up. And so I was your quintessential young evangelical, sold out to the movement. And that was just 4 short years ago. When I began my time at Moody, I was all in. I had been longing to go to Bible college since I was 12, which is when I got saved, became a Christian, and within 4 months of that, had a strong sense of calling to become a pastor. And so I always longed to go to Bible college. Moody was actually a liberal stretch for me, because for the longest time I wanted to go to Bob Jones University or Pensacola Christian College. And so going to Moody I thought was a pretty progressive move for me. And so, yeah, early on in my Moody career, I made a couple friends with similar passions, and we decided that we were going to search out Chicago for the one true church that was going to resonate with us and that we could join with over the next 4 years. And so we spent the whole first semester, for the first couple of months in Chicago, visiting all the Reformed evangelical churches in downtown Chicago. And surprisingly, at the end of the whole semester, we hadn't identified one community that we really felt was preaching the gospel as we thought should be preached as arrogant young Bible college students, and no community that we really resonated with. So went home for winter break, and after returning to Chicago, I guess some demonic force came into our head, and we decided that we were going to start visiting churches outside of the evangelical tradition just for the heck of it. And so over the next couple months, we visited Catholic, Orthodox, Mainline, Mormon, AME, and a vast variety of other faith communities. Every time we walked into those communities, we stuck out like sore thumbs, except for in the Mormon church, where our suits and ties blended in with everybody else. The more we explored all these various communities that we had been told over the years of growing up as an evangelical were anti-Christ, false teachers, false prophets, we realized how misinformed we had been. Because I'd sit in the gay-affirming, post-evangelical church with a woman pastor and feel more welcomed than I ever felt in any evangelical church. And I would sit there and hear the gospel proclaimed more powerfully than I ever heard John Piper or John MacArthur proclaim it. We sat in a Catholic Mass, and we were blown away by the beauty of the liturgy and how people actually weren't just doing things ritualistically and rotely, but they were deeply committed to their Catholic faith, which was something we didn't think was possible. Time and time again, we experienced people who genuinely loved Jesus in communities that we had been told were dangerous, deceived, and deluded. And this reality began to cause some subtle shifts in my spirit. I began to realize that perhaps my tradition could actually be wrong, and that notion was validated time and time again with every experience, with every time we sat down with one of these pastors or talked with one of the congregations or went out for the potluck afterwards. And I began to see that so much of my tradition was rooted in fear of the other. So much of it was demonized those who had a different theological system than we did. I began to discover that what most evangelicals so closely identified with as the pillars and the core of our faith, the Republican Party, our own denominations and coalitions, and even finer points of theology like inerrancy, rapture, penal substitutionary atonement, all of this good stuff, those were not really determining factors of whether somebody had a good relationship with God. And this revelation to me was quite that. It was a revelation. It was shaking and shattering, because this was something that was so foreign to my evangelical identity. How could these people who didn't believe that the Bible was literally inspired by God and every single word and scientific fact and historical fact was true? But once again, my experience with so many varying traditions gave me first-hand proof that God's Spirit was actually at work in traditions outside of evangelical Christianity. And so this experience over my second semester at Moody in Chicago ignited a distinct passion in this young evangelical spirit. And that passion was to begin to try to work to build bridges and cultivate conversations in my tradition with the broader spectrum of Christianity. And the way that manifested was I started a radio show with 2 other friends on Moody Campus Radio called The Bridge. And the whole purpose of that was to expose Moody's community to people like N.T. Wright, who was a heretic, or Miroslav Volf. We had different voices we'd introduce to the community that were taboo, and allow them to speak for themselves and hear what they had to say and what they believe, and fix our misconceptions about them, and hopefully realize we had more common ground with all these people than we once thought. And so we surprisingly got some big names to join our bridge building interviews, and our radio show began to pick up traction even beyond Moody. Initially, we received some pushback. The first time we really got pushback at Moody was when we interviewed Laura Truex, who is a woman pastor in Chicago. And we began to receive more and more pushback as we continued to venture outside of the evangelical bubble. At the end of our first season, we announced that next season we had lined up an interview with the one and only Brian McLaren. And after having voices like Tony Campolo, N.T. Wright, and even Tony Jones on our show during the first semester, we didn't think it would be a problem. But within a week of our posters for season 2 going up around campus, we received notice that our show had been canceled, and that our station manager had been receiving dozens of complaints, and that we would even consider bringing someone like Brian McLaren on air on Moody's radio network. And once again, this event really began to mess with my spirit. So people were afraid that we were going to talk with Brian McLaren. Since when was having a conversation with somebody dangerous? Even I, as an evangelical, as somebody who grew up fundamentalist, knew that conversation wasn't dangerous. I could talk to people, learn about people, and I didn't have to believe or agree with them. So after giving that pushback, I would be summoned into a meeting with the dean of the undergraduate school concerning my theological fitness to be at Moody Bible Institute. And when I went into that meeting for the first time, I trembled with fear, quite literally. I couldn't believe that talking to those who were different could lead to such a severe response, possibly being expelled from my Bible college. I went into that meeting and was asked to a number of theological questions based on who I had interacted with on my show and in a few blog posts. I was asked for my views on hell, homosexuality, inerrancy, a couple other evangelical pillars. Of course, at the time, I still identified as a conservative evangelical. I was just talking to people. And so I affirmed everything that they wanted me to affirm, and I was then told by the dean that he was still suspicious of me, that he thought I could be lying to him, and that I was going to be watched closely for the rest of my Moody career, and held accountable for every interaction and thing I wrote. The professor in the meeting also admonished me to stop blogging and talking publicly altogether, because I had nothing good to say anyways. And so as I left that meeting, my spirit was absolutely crushed. I recognized that there was a sense of profound injustice about this type of censorship, this fear that was being placed on me as a student in a school who was just trying to learn about other people. It was then, and at that moment, that I finally realized and saw firsthand how broken evangelicalism had become. And it was this reason, and out of this season of my life, that I started this vision for something called Revangelical. The mission of Revangelical was to cultivate rethinking, reforming, and renewing of evangelical faith among young evangelicals who were engaged in similar processes like me. My experience visiting and interviewing non-evangelicals convinced me that my tradition had a lot to learn, and the fear tactics that I was experiencing firsthand highlighted just how far the movement had gone from being people of good news, people committed to justice and the gospel and being about Jesus. So I turned our canceled radio show into a podcast and launched the Revangelical blog and began to continue engaging in these conversations that were already occurring all over evangelicalism. Over the next 3 years of my Moody career, I would undergo significant theological, political, and ideological changes, and would end up in professors' and deans' offices 6 more times before graduating last month, with the threat of being expelled from Moody every time. Thank you. Yeah, it's by God's grace that I graduated last month. In this season, the blog and podcast began to take off, and as the movement grew, I personally grew. I was confronted with this question time and time again over the past few years. Was Moody the right place for me at all? Why was I still so concerned about being their brand of evangelicalism. I wrestled seriously with this question as the situation at Moody got worse and worse and more uncomfortable over the years. After a season of reflection and applying to North Park University and other schools in Chicago, I became convinced that I still was right where I belonged, at Moody Bible Institute. Because I loved my tradition. I loved my people. Whether they admit it or not, I was still an evangelical, and I sensed a distinct calling to work to reform from the inside of my tradition. And no, it hasn't been easy over the past 4 years, but I cannot tell you the unbelievable amount of time students and professors have called me into their office and off the record told me how blessed they were and how they were going down the same path and how they were wrestling with the same questions and how much we needed something like Revangelical. I received countless emails from millennials and senior citizens who have been deeply hurt by evangelicalism and are desperately looking and hoping to see a renewed version of evangelical Christianity emerge. Over the years, I've been joined by hundreds of others who are engaging in Revangelical type projects, working to create something fresh and beautiful from the ashes of evangelicalism. And these are exciting and hope-filled times. God is still on the move in evangelical Christianity, and new life is bursting forth everywhere, whether we can see it or not. And so it's this story that leads me to where we are today at this talk at Wild Goose Festival, asking the question, can evangelicalism be liberated from the theological, political, ideological, social baggage that's been placed on it? Can evangelicalism be saved, and should it be? And that's the conversation I want to have today. That's really what I want to do here. It's not me standing up here talking, because I have far more that I can learn from you all than you can learn from me. And so over the next half hour, I really want to engage in conversation around this. Should we be working to create a new kind of evangelicalism, or has the movement seen its best days and is it over? But before we jump into the discussion, give me 5 more minutes and I will tell you my answer to this question. If you would have asked me last year if I thought evangelicalism was worth saving, I would have absolutely unequivocally answered yes. I've written articles, done interviews, started this whole movement about why evangelicalism is worth saving. But today, as I stand here at Wild Goose, my answer is actually absolutely not. Evangelicalism isn't worth saving, and nor can it be saved. But stay with me for a second. The realization is new to me, but I think it comes from a good place. It actually comes from a series of conversations I've had. And in order to explain it, I just want to use the metaphor of a ship. Evangelicalism is a large cruise liner. It has so many parts and people and movements within its boundaries. Over the past 70-plus years, evangelicalism has played a major role in global Christianity. For many decades, evangelicalism has been an important safe haven for those who are neither fundamentalist or liberal. And for years, evangelicalism has been on the forefront of revival and renewal in Christianity worldwide. But like with all movements, it has grown stale and stagnant with age. Many people have hijacked the movement as a platform to promote political and social agendas that had little to do with the founding principles of the evangelical movement. Unfortunately, all the baggage that has been placed on the movement has been fully embraced by many and has become a fundamental part of what it looks like to be an evangelical today. The crew of the ship has been well staffed. The way the ship is run has become normative. Anyone who attempts to mess with the way the ship is run will be thrown overboard, quite literally. But in our day, it has also become clear that SS evangelicalism has hit an iceberg and is taking on water very quickly. Over the past few years, I've been a part of a group of people who have rushed to the bows of the ship to try to mend the hole and stop water from rushing in and sinking our ship. The problem is that the hole is too big. Evangelicalism has been damaged too severely, and all of the telltale signs of the movement's end are emerging. Infighting between factions within evangelicalism, dominant power players fighting to steer the ship, misplaced passions and agendas, losing focus on the gospel and pouring time and money into politics and factions, and not being willing to innovate and adapt to new things, and then new young evangelicals leaving. You all heard about the big exodus from churches and evangelicalism, and in mainline and a whole bunch of other movements as well. The point is that evangelicalism is sinking fast. And so many of us have poured time and energy into trying to stop the ship's demise. But a friend of mine recently pointed out to me that trying to mend the hull is not the best use of our energies. Going to the bows of the ship and trying to save the existing structure that's been around for 70 to 100 years is not where the life is at. It's another friend of mine, Doug Paget, has said, Reformation is not a biblical theme. Death and resurrection are. Every movement in church history faces death. It faces an end. And from that end, always God is faithful to raise up a new, fresh movement. So to spend time and precious energies trying to stop the process of death and resurrection is actually counterproductive. Instead of trying to save SS Evangelicalism, maybe our energies would be better spent trying to create life rafts to save evangelicals, who are rapidly abandoning the ship and are often getting tossed and lost in the raging seas. There are a lot of young evangelicals that are leaving the faith altogether, and I don't think that's the option. I don't think any of us should be happy to see that. I understand spiritual journeys take us in different places, but to see people lost because of doubt and cynicism and hurt is not something I'm willing to watch. Evangelicalism itself is not worth saving, but evangelicals are most certainly worth saving. Instead of allowing our brothers and sisters to be tossed in the waves, which means leaving faith altogether for many, maybe we could work and move with God's Spirit in a new way, with new fresh expressions of faith for a new generation. God's wild Spirit is pushing the sails of these new life rafts and putting us in uncharted territories. And I believe that my job and our job is to pull as many disenchanted evangelicals and mainliners and everybody else whose ships are sinking into these new lifeboats and embark on new, exciting journeys of cultivating and creating new, compassionate expressions of what it looks like to follow Jesus. I don't know what that looks like, but it is super exciting. And so with that said, I'm giving you my piece on that, I'd like to really begin this conversation with you guys around the two questions. Is evangelicalism worth saving in your opinion? Do you think I'm off base here? Can it be saved? And what movements from within evangelicalism are you aware that are emerging